Hello, everyone. Thanks for tuning in to this week's episode of the Health Me podcast, episode number 59. Amy, thank you again for coming on the podcast again. It is the second time for you coming on, so thanks again.
Absolutely. It's great to be back.
Today, I hope to answer many questions pertaining to perhaps what a lot of people have seen in the news about Roe v. Wade, as well as additional information on how to seek access to care and what it means at an individual level, and also what it means like state by state and so on. But before we get into that, I would love for you to just briefly maybe describe your current role. And you're constantly busy. In fact, you've flown back from Ohio just this morning to do the podcast. So I really appreciate you coming on again. But why don't you just give a brief description of your current role and then where maybe like how you've gotten to where you're at?
Yeah, absolutely. So my name is Amy Potter. I'm a family medicine physician, but within family medicine, I have really kind of specialized over the past 10 years in reproductive and sexual healthcare, and specifically abortion healthcare. So currently, I provide abortion care primarily for the Planned Parenthood of Greater Ohio, in Cleveland, and also Columbus as well. And I have been providing there for about 8 or 9 months now. I originally started going over there just because they frankly needed some additional docs to help cover and provide access in their clinics. And, this really does kind of dovetail into where we're going to go here today. But, it's tough to get docs to move to a state where I think a lot of us within the abortion community who provide this care have felt this looming sense that something big might happen for access within abortion care. And so, I think that really factors into a decision that a doctor might make about where they choose to plant roots and start their career. And so it's been more challenging in a lot of the states that we'll end up talking about for them to even get physicians to move there in the past few years, with folks kind of knowing something may come, something may change. And not that I feel like we're all pessimists, but I think a lot of us have been realists. And I may have alluded to that in our last podcast, even that a lot of us have been realists in feeling like something pretty big and unfortunately catastrophic for abortion access might happen under our watch in the next couple of years. And unfortunately, we're seeing that come to fruition in recent weeks and months. So I provide abortion care in Cleveland, Ohio. I also support the gender affirming hormone care program for that Planned Parenthood of Greater Ohio, as well as for the Planned Parenthoods in my local area. So I do a lot of consulting with their nurse practitioners and PAs about what the best care is for trans and non-binary folks. And then I provide opioid use disorder care for a telehealth company. So I'm a classic family medicine doctor in that I have many different interests and I can never really settle on one. And I think the common thread in all three of those is really stigma and lack of access, and also, needing good people to show up and do the work. And what really intrigues me about all three of those areas is that the work is partly medicine, but it's also showing up and advocating for our patients in other spaces as well. And, certainly we're seeing this come to light in recent weeks. For abortion care, that means advocating on both legal and political levels. And then obviously for trans and substance use disorder care, there's some similarities there too. So I always say, to me, the most interesting parts of medicine is where, we have to really advocate for our patients on a holistic level, not just on the providing medications and doing the service level. We have to kind of show up in other spaces.
Was there an experience prior to, I obviously want to touch base on all those things, and the fact that you are speaking up for so many patients and people is very admirable, but was there an experience for yourself that maybe early in your career that motivated you to kind of go down this route of motivated, or not motivating, but you being motivated to help patients and speak out for them, for people who maybe not have a voice?
I think so. My pathway to medicine initially was not direct. I initially in college really avoided science. I'll be honest; it was not my primary area of interest. I actually studied history and was really focused on being a writer at that point in my life. I worked for the school newspaper, and this will tie back, I promise. But what I loved about writing at that point in my life was the idea of getting to know people and to be able to tell their stories, and really to be able to hear their stories and tell their stories. In actuality, I found that sort of hard to do within journalism, and felt like, oh gosh, there's a bit more of a formulaic approach to journalism a lot, and it didn't end up being quite the right fit for me. But I think that feeling or that desire to connect with people and hear their stories and bear witness to their stories is that common thread in how I've ended up where I am today. And I think that is truly what motivates me, is those intimate moments that I get to share with patients. And that is true every single day that I provide abortion care. It is interesting. A lot of patients do want to share with me why they're having an abortion. It's important for them to be able to share what's happening in their life, their context that is leading them to this decision. Not for everyone, but for a lot of people, it is something that they want to share. And I consider that moment really a driving motivation for what I do. It's a little bit selfish too. A lot of times they're incredibly thankful and tell me, about whatever they're doing, that this is going to allow them to be able to do, whether that's, going back to school or starting a business or being able to raise the children that they have who they love so much. In that moment, there's a lot of gratitude. And I've even had people in the past week say, you really saved my life. This truly saved my life. And so there's a little bit of, positive reward for me in that as well. And that's a really nice feeling. And that's a feeling that I think sometimes is kind of elusive for folks who work in medicine. There's, I watched a New York Times opinion clips interviewing nurses who've been working throughout the pandemic, and hearing some of the literal physical and also emotional abuse that they get from patients who are also in difficult situations, and just the system, really not supporting them in the work that they do. And I feel incredibly grateful that I get those intense moments with patients so often, where we really connect and have gratitude. And that's certainly not every encounter, but there are quite a few. And they often, a lot of patients ask me why I do what I do. They'll say, gosh, how did you get into this? Or why do you do what you do? And, I always say it's just so important to me that there is someone here for you today. And also it's incredibly meaningful that I get to hear your story and be able to be here for you today. And then I also often joke that as somebody who trained in family medicine and primary care, I joke with them, I'm like, whew, this is a lot better than examining toe fungus or some of those things that are out there, So
What do you mean? That sounds great.
Here I am having this really wonderful emotional connection, and I get to provide you a really important service. So then I joke about old men feet. They're the worst. So
Yeah.
those toenails.
Right. Yeah. I think we can all agree on that topic, but I can definitely agree with that. And something that brought me into physical therapy as well is the patient experience and the stories and the things that you hear, and be able to provide an impact and, have so much play on so many different aspects of a person's life, right? Like someone coming into the clinic for me, they're always going to be like their first experience with exercise sometimes. And it's, that conversation that you're having with that person is going to dictate their actions for the rest of their life. And I'm assuming you're seeing the same thing for people coming into your clinic.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. And getting to, I think, honestly, have those connections where you establish trust with other human beings too, which I think particularly during COVID and other things, it's harder and harder to also feel like I get to make those connections with other human beings who I don't know. I think it makes me a better person for having to kind of get to know people and put myself in their shoes too. So, yeah.
Absolutely. Well, part of your job was to help people and bring them from point A to point B, so to speak. But in order for you to do that, you have to stay up to date with everything that's going on in legislation and everything that affects your job.
Right.
And more recently, as we've been kind of like going around and circling the idea, is Roe v. Wade. Now, you had talked about earlier that there had been like this like buildup, and a lot of other clinicians have already kind of, and we talked about this in the last episode, that you kind of saw this thing coming. What were some of the telltale signs that something like this was happening, and maybe like get into exactly what Roe v. Wade is?
Absolutely. So I think the reason why we all saw this coming is because those of us within the abortion community have seen how organized the anti-abortion community has been for decades. And I think that's maybe why all of us are like, we've seen this coming perhaps more than a layperson who doesn't work in abortion care. You know, my colleagues and myself have, been receiving death threats and letters for decades, and abortion providers have, been attacked physically and killed previously in previous decades. And we've seen, the just consistent and persistent mobilization of the anti-abortion community. So whether that's, receiving personal death threats or having to drive through people every single day that you show up to work who, have signs and are in protest or are praying or yelling at you. I think that that seed was just planted for us repeatedly over and over again. And that persistent drum doesn't just show up in parking lots, but also has been really deliberate and intentional about organizing both politically and thereby towards the legal system. And so this work towards replacing the Supreme Court with anti-abortion judges has been in the works for a very, very long time. And so I'll be honest, I have some colleagues who, going back to when Congress, when Mitch McConnell refused to hear Merrick Garland's nomination by President Obama in the final year of his presidency, who is basically the Supreme Court judge who would have been in the place of Brett Kavanaugh had he been, actually a hearing had been done by the Senate for that nominee, but instead they refused to have a hearing for Merrick Garland and thereby pushed that nomination out of the Obama presidency and into the Trump presidency. And I think a lot of folks, the sort of feeling of negativity and a bit of realistic pessimism started back then. And then I think certainly when Justice Ginsburg unfortunately passed away, which assured Trump a second nomination to the Supreme Court after Brett Kavanaugh with Amy Coney Barrett, I think all of us really felt like the writing was unfortunately on the wall at that point, because that shifted specifically around the issue of abortion, that shifted the dynamic and power of the court completely. I will get on one soapbox here to point out that all of those justices, Kavanaugh and Amy Coney Barrett specifically, under oath said that they, would uphold the constitutional precedent of Roe v. Wade. But I think even though all of us heard that during the hearing, it did not reassure very many of us who work within the community. And I think, I've had a lot of folks over the years, including Lover, my mother, who's like, don't worry, it's going to be okay. She's like, they said they wouldn't overturn Roe v. Wade. They won't do it. And, for years I've been like, love you, Mom, appreciate the optimism. But unfortunately, I think we all know what's coming. And we're seeing that come to fruition now. So I will talk a little bit now about what we know based on a Politico article that was published early May, I think May 3rd of this year. So Politico somehow, and that will be subject to much debate over the next couple of years, Politico somehow got a draft of the pending Supreme Court decision on a case called Dobbs versus Jackson Women's Health Organization. And basically what that case is in a very quick nutshell is a case that has been challenged up through different state courts now to federal courts that says, is it constitutional to have a 15-week ban on abortion in the state of Mississippi? And so that has made its way all the way up to the Supreme Court. And that is the case at hand here. And what this leaked draft says essentially is that there is no protection for the 15-week ban. And what we have come to know in this leaked draft is that it seems that the Supreme Court majority response on this opinion, which is written I believe by Alito, is saying that there is no federal protection for abortion, period. So not even at 15 weeks, but basically saying there's no federal protection for abortion. And that is in of itself basically an overturning of Roe v. Wade. So if we back up one step further, a lot of folks know Roe v. Wade made abortion legal, but what does that mean actually? Roe v. Wade basically said there is federal protection for abortion. And so by saying there's federal protection, that means by default, you have to have access to abortion in all 50 states. So what this decision would do is overturn Roe v. Wade in the sense that it would say now there's no federal protection for abortion. It now will default to whatever's on the books in your state. So instead of being federally mandated, abortion will now come down to how it is protected in the state where you live. And so that's why we're now seeing lots of laws pop up in particular states, kind of with this decision looming, honestly, these states are kind of revving their engines and getting ready to put laws into place that make it basically inaccessible or less accessible to access abortion within that state specifically. Does that make sense?
Absolutely. Yeah. I just wanted to make sure that was the last word there.
Yeah.
So interesting that, so Roe v. Wade was a while ago, and then now this more
1973. Yeah.
Right. And so this other case was more recent. And so based on the fact that Mississippi, or this case within Mississippi, believes that it should not be at the federal level, people should not have abortions. It will now go, if this is the right word, overturned.
So basically what Mississippi is saying is we want to have a ban at 15 weeks in our state. And right now with Roe v. Wade in place, they can't do that because Roe v. Wade protects accessibility of abortion up to basically viability. And so putting this in place is kind of at odds with Roe. So that's how it's kind of gotten challenged all the way up. So Mississippi didn't put this case together thinking necessarily about the rest of the country. They, the Mississippi case is really about what's happening in Mississippi. But then what happens is it has cascading consequences for all the other states in the rest of the country. Sorry, you were asking another part of that question, but I just wanted to clarify that.
No, that's okay. No, that makes sense. And I just want to make sure I'm right. I don't want to say anything incorrectly here.
No. And it's complicated. And one of the funny parts is I often end up being a translator of this. And I'm like, oof, I'm sure if a lawyer is watching this show right now, particularly when he does constitutional law, they're probably like, ooh, not exactly all the right terms. But it's one of the ways I humble myself to know how my patients feel when I use lots of medical language, is hanging out with lawyers when they talk about this in deep conversation is really humbling. They have a whole other language.
Yeah, I believe it. And I've listened to lawyers talk as well. Even just preparing for this podcast, I listened to a couple of things. I'm caught myself 5 minutes in, okay, I actually have to really think about this, maybe look up a word or two here to understand, see what's actually going on. It's sometimes I have no idea what they're saying.
Exactly. One of the other pieces that I think they would clarify is that Roe v. Wade basically says that it affirms a federal constitutional right to abortion. And so the reason why I point that out is that the majority opinion that was leaked, you may have seen lots of memes about this, but a lot of what the logic from the majority opinion is saying is that ultimately there's not a constitutional protection for abortion written into the Constitution. And so you may have seen some memes about how they really did cite in this leaked opinion. We'll see if it's, the published opinion eventually, but they really used some sources from, back when women didn't have the right to vote and other things. So some of their sources are pulled from the 1700s and 1800s. And so,
It's a good time period to pull from.
Exactly. And I think that really for the folks who are law nerds, that really gets into this idea of these strict constitutionalists on the court, really trying to read the Constitution as it was written at the time of the document, which, here we are.
Here we are. Yeah. And is the 15-week time period really important in regards to just abortion care? I mean, maybe just speak as to why 15 weeks is so important and crucial.
Absolutely. So 15 weeks, well, I will say now that we're looking at potentially having no access to abortion in a lot of states as a potential down the road, which we can get into, I would certainly say being able to access abortion up until 15 weeks is great. That is an excellent place to start. That being said, it really doesn't offer access for people who commonly encounter some barriers that would need them to access abortion after 15 weeks.
Mm.
And I would say the most common place where I see that happen is for people who either didn't realize that they were pregnant until, a couple of months in, which is not so darn uncommon. There's lots of issues with irregular periods out there and other things. And certainly during times of stress like COVID, that's a very relevant thing to be talking about. So, there is the possibility that you don't discover you're pregnant until a couple of months in. And then maybe you want to take a few weeks to think about what you want to do with the pregnancy. And then maybe you need to make a few calls in order to access care, or more commonly for the patients that I see in Ohio, maybe you need to figure out how you're going to pay for an abortion and put together some funds in order to make that happen. And all of a sudden, 15 weeks is not that long. If you didn't realize you were pregnant until 8 or 10 weeks in, which is not uncommon at all, you take a couple of weeks to think about it, you take a couple of weeks to figure out how to pay for it. We're already talking 14, 15 weeks into the pregnancy. So there's that situation of just, life reality. I think the other common issue is that people sometimes have to get places to get abortion care. And that not only increases costs, but it also means you have to figure out how you're going to maybe take time off of work and how you're going to get there. And that is a common reason when I've encountered patients who've had to travel to access care, that they end up needing an abortion into the early second trimester, at 14, 15, 16 weeks.
Mm.
And then, thirdly, when we're talking about, patients who may be pursuing abortion for medical reasons or because of an anomaly with the fetus, those really are not detectable, frankly, until after 15 weeks. There are some things that during first trimester screening can be detected. But, most people have their first what's called a fetal anatomy scan, which is really where you basically go through all the fetal parts and kind of make sure that they're developing correctly. Most people have that done between 16 and 20 weeks of a pregnancy. And so, for a lot of those cases where people may have pregnancies that are desired, but where anomalies are detected and they determine that the best course for them is to end a pregnancy, that's not often something that can even be figured out until after 15 weeks. So for all of those reasons, I think it's important for people to be able to access abortion after 15 weeks. That being said, again, when we're talking about, the idea of some states really having zero access to abortion, I certainly would take 15 weeks over something like a heartbeat ban or zero access to abortion. One of the states where I work, Ohio, currently on the books has a heartbeat ban. It was voted in by the legislature. It was then enjoined by the courts. And from what I understand, that means it basically means they put a hold on it saying, this is getting appealed. This may not be constitutional. So while we work this law through the courts, it cannot be implemented because we're concerned, it's got to go through the appeal system. So currently, we do not have to follow the heartbeat ban. But I suspect that may change, or they may try to implement an entirely different law if and when SCOTUS actually publishes their decision on the Dobbs case with the Roe v. Wade implications. And something like a heartbeat ban is really catastrophic for patients. And what that means is basically if you can detect a heartbeat on ultrasound, then you cannot provide an abortion to that patient. And heartbeats are detectable starting as early as 5 weeks into pregnancy, but can start between 5 and 6 weeks of pregnancy. For most people, that means they would have missed their period somewhere between 5 to 10 to 14 days before that. So we're talking about people needing to know that they missed their period, call and make an appointment, get that ultrasound done before a heartbeat is detected, which sometimes could be like literally a 5 to 10 day window around the time that you miss your period. And so that's, nearly impossible for most people who probably don't even know that they're pregnant yet.
Right.
Certainly for some people, I actually, I had the chance to work with a colleague from Texas this week. They are looking for some travel work to continue to be able to use their surgical skills because currently in Texas, they're not able to provide in-clinic abortion or surgical abortion. And so they're looking for a place to be able to go and do those skills. And so are working with us in Ohio a little bit. And they were sharing with me that they are actually able to provide about 20 to 50 abortions a week at their site in Texas currently. And those are 20 to 50 women per week who have figured all of that out, that they got pregnant, they managed to get themselves in, which I think speaks to the fact that women are very aware of what's happening in the courts. And for a lot of folks, if they realize that they may be pregnant and they don't want to be, are really on it and trying to get themselves in as quickly as possible. That being said, 20 to 50 is a drastically reduced number, obviously, to what they were able to provide before. But I thought it was pretty impressive that they're able to do that many per week with those restrictions.
Well, it's extremely complicated because, like, first of all, if it's a heartbeat thing, and it happens around 5 weeks and it's a 10-minute window and you don't know you're pregnant until like week 8 or 10. And then you don't even know if there's anything wrong with it until week 16. There's like a lot of variables that can happen in that time frame. And outside of the medical, implications, like as we're discussing, like the heartbeat and like what we think of, I do believe at some point, us as humans have to answer the question of like when a human is a human. Obviously that's above our conversation, today. But I kind of want to get into, I do believe there are people who believe that like a lot of the women who get abortions, or maybe they're just like careless and they don't care, and they're just not really thinking about this. But there are like, maybe you can speak to like the numbers as to like how common is it that women are unaware that they're pregnant up until week 8 and 10, and like what are and also in addition, not even just like missing a period, but like some women are on birth control and they get pregnant. So they're like, wouldn't expect to even get pregnant. So just like, what is it super common? Is it uncommon? Is it a big majority of people who are getting like abortions? I guess like maybe just speak to the numbers in that regard.
I will speak and I can give some like bigger numbers, but I'm going to focus actually on like the 2 days that I provided care this week. And so I provided care on Thursday and Friday this week. And when I'm in Ohio, I do a mix of both medication and in-clinic abortion. So the first kind of thing that I want to dispel is the idea that, first of all, the majority of abortions would be after like 15 or 16 weeks, like we were talking about. And that is just absolutely not true. I think the statistic is around like 92 to 95% of abortions provided in the United States are in the first trimester. And so that's, really talking about like 13 weeks and less. And so I would say on Thursday and Friday, I think I saw about like 25 patients for abortions. I would say more than half of them chose to do medication abortion. And that is in line with statistics that we see across the United States, that really the majority of people opt for medication now over an in-clinic procedure, or what's also called surgical abortion. I'll take a little quick tangent here to say I tend to not use the term surgical abortion because it's really not a surgery. I'm a family medicine physician. I am definitely not a surgeon. You would not want me to operate on anything on you. And it really is an in-clinic procedure. I am a family medicine doctor who loves to do procedures, though. I also love to inject joints and like lots of other things. But it really is a procedure, meaning like there's no cutting, things like that. So the majority of people really do opt for medication abortion as opposed to the in-clinic procedure. And in order to have a medication abortion, really the protocols, we do have protocols that allow for medication abortion up to 11 weeks of pregnancy. Unfortunately, in the state of Ohio, there are restrictions in the state code that say we can only offer it up to 9 weeks. But I think that's a really quick indicator to folks that if the majority of folks are opting for medication, and we're only able to offer medication up to somewhere between 9 and 11 weeks, depending on the state that you're operating in, the majority of abortions happening in the United States are happening very early in pregnancy. And so even though I did speak to the importance of allowing access for some of those cases that might require having an abortion later in pregnancy, when it really when it really comes to the day-to-day of providing abortion care, the vast majority of people that I see have pregnancies, somewhere between 5 and 10 weeks. And then I probably have a handful of folks that I see that maybe have pregnancies more advanced than that. So I think that's just really helpful context to know that really that's what's happening for the majority of America. I'll take a little detour here, a little side trip to say, since this leaked decision, and certainly in the past couple of years, I will say, I think women are aware that there's decreasing access. And I think people are getting to clinic earlier in pregnancy as a result. If they find themselves pregnant and they can't be or don't want to be, I feel like they're identifying it and getting in quicker. And I think that comes from some anxiety around worry that they may not have access down the road. So
even perhaps maybe just people are having more conversations about it. Maybe it's just more normalized and people are able to identify and be like, it's more okay.
I like that positive spin. I'm going to hope that that's part of it, Mike. I like that.
I would like to hope so too, right?
Exactly. Yeah. So I hope that answered some of kind of the broad questions about abortion care. I feel like you had a couple of other questions in there too.
Yeah. So in regards to just so you kind of answered it by describing some of the numbers. So technically a late term abortion would be after 15 weeks. Is that technically late? Or is it like after 12 weeks, or because you put in majorities between like the 9 to 12 week mark. So I don't want to say anything that's incorrect.
Yeah. Let me just provide some feedback around language. So
yes,
within the abortion community, we do not use the term late term abortion because it's not a medical term. There is no such thing as late term in pregnancy. That's not a thing. So we talk about abortion within the medical community by exactly what it is, the weeks it is. So what I would say is that it is incredibly rare to have an abortion after 24 weeks of pregnancy. And the reason for that is that 23 to 24 weeks has been determined to be the line of quote unquote fetal viability. And the idea there is that's the time at which a fetus could potentially survive outside of the womb. And so that I think is an important line, because the number of abortions that happen after that are so minuscule that I think it's really important for people to understand how rare those are. And there may be cases where it is elective for whatever reason, but the vast majority of those cases are happening a lot of times due to fetal anomalies. And that's a lot of, you may hear some heartbreaking stories from parents who wanted to pursue this because of a devastating medical condition in the fetus, and had trouble accessing care for that reason. Below 24 weeks, I would say there's also a big gap between basically like 14 weeks and 24 weeks, also diminishing numbers. And then below 14 weeks, that's where really the bulk and the majority of abortion is happening, both in the United States and the world. So below 14 weeks is where I would say that's what I would call a first trimester abortion. And then that 14 to 24 weeks would be more of your second trimester abortion. And then beyond that, that's where I would say we really talk about abortion as like the specific thing that it is. So abortion at 26 weeks, or abortion for a fetal anomaly for whatever fetal anomaly has been detected. So the late term, or, you may have heard some like partial birth abortion. Those are all terms that honestly were created by the anti-abortion community. And I kind of think have allowed some of these threads of misinformation. But because even like, honestly, like folks that we might consider advocating for abortion or showing up will use some of those terms. And so it really has kind of gotten into the common language. But within, I'd say, kind of our medical community, we talk about it, what it is, like first trimester abortion, second trimester abortion. And then, kind of beyond that, certainly third trimester abortion, so rare that usually we would talk about it with whatever the specific case is. This is a 26-week abortion happening, sort of for XYZ reasons.
Got it. So majority, you said 92 to 95% is under that 12-week mark. And then so
I'm going to get some I'm going to pull up some actual statistics while you
perfect. Yeah, we're right here. Yeah. But it is good that, we can get an idea that there are a majority of women who are, they understand their body enough, and, they are within that first trimester to be able to get that abortion and get in the clinic and get the help that they need, so long as the access to that care is available in their state, and they have the monetary and ability to have an abortion comfortably and safely and so on. And it's probably good for people to understand that, because I do think people use I would have used late term abortion and never would have thought that it's, anything, not in bad context, but just, you hear it so often. So it's just like something they use over and over again. But perhaps, do you have those numbers pulled up?
All right. I should know this.
Okay.
I knew it was low. Okay. So 1.3 to 1.4% of abortions happen after 21 weeks.
Okay.
So that's after 21 weeks. And so, I think what a lot of people get really emotional or have an emotional response to thinking about, which I do too, is, I think it's hard when people think about something that they may be able to identify as like a baby and thinking, those are like a baby that you might see come out in a delivery room. And there's been a lot of images that have been put out there about like, those are, right before birth, there's an abortion that is done. And that is just not true. And also in the cases where maybe something is done later, where again, that viability, where maybe the fetus could survive out the womb, the percentage of those is so small. And usually within that, there's some really, I would say, compelling context or other things happening that lead people to be into those situations. One of the other things that I like to share one of the questions you asked before, it was a tangent I wanted to go on when we were sort of talking about this idea of carelessness or, people just maybe not being responsible. One of the statistics that I like to point out is that most people who are having an abortion are already mothers. And a lot of women that I take care of come to me and say, I love being a mom. This is one of the most important things in my life, and this is my most important job. And unfortunately, in order to continue to do a good job for the kids that I have, I don't think I can do one more. And so I often reflect back to them that I think this is a really incredibly selfless thing that they're doing, to show up and do something that might be actually kind of personally hard and bring some sadness and bring mixed emotions for them, in order to be able to be a really awesome mom to the ones that they have, or to be able to continue to struggle to do two jobs, to be able to pay the bills, to provide for the kids that they have. And so I think that's important to know, that a lot of women are already mothers, and are really, really good, conscientious people who are trying to show up and do the best thing for their families. I think another thing you asked is, are there contraceptive failures? Yes, all the time. I'll take a little side note here to say that, unfortunately, the thing that we know is like the most common birth control in the United States, which I'm not here to knock it, but the pill has a pretty high failure rate. Like, it doesn't work, up to 8 to 10% of the time. And certainly for most people, it's pretty hard to remember to take a pill every day, even though it sounds like a simple task. And so I see failure rates all the time. And so I think one of the other things we can talk about is, expanding access to effective contraceptive for folks, and making sure they know what their options are, making sure their insurance covers those options. There's just so many barriers and layers that lead up to the idea of like, well, why can't you just take a pill every day? Or why can't you just do XYZ thing to prevent pregnancy? So I think there's lots of things that we could be doing to support people, both with getting effective methods into their hands or uteruses in this case, and then also making sure that we give them insurance support for those things. I'm constantly shocked by what insurance does not cover in Ohio. It's really remarkable. Mike, you're in California, right?
Correct.
And do you, in your work, do you interact with insurance? Is that part of your dynamic?
Absolutely. Yeah. It's always
Mhm.
something. Well, I think we thankfully have a good team to not deal with it too bad, but it's definitely, just from a legislation point of view, just being a physical therapist, sometimes you see things like in like news articles or, journals, and you're just like, what are we doing here?
Yeah.
I'm sure you do the same thing.
Well, it's so interesting. I actually, traveling to Ohio um, has been so eye-opening. It has really made me realize that I reside in New York State, and that's really where I've practiced clinically for the past 10 years. And it makes me realize how spoiled I am in New York State, specifically for reproductive and sexual health. New York State does cover abortion care. If you're on Medicaid, it also covers every contraceptive choice under the sun. That is absolutely not true of Ohio Medicaid. It does not cover abortion, and it does not cover every option for contraception either. And then there are cascading consequences from that if there's no state mandate to protect abortion or contraception within the insurance plans. Then most of the private payers follow what the public payers do. So most private insurance plans in Ohio don't cover abortion. And a lot of them don't cover all of the contraceptions either, which blows my mind because IUDs are a little bit expensive up front, but economically over the time that the device can exist in your body and work for you, it's actually a really good economic choice, and it's very effective. And from a public health perspective, it would decrease complications and improve outcomes. But for some reason, all the insurance plans do not cover IUDs. So it's really made me realize how spoiled I am in New York State, and really makes me kind of have this eye opener of like, wow, where you live has such implications for the type of care that you receive from a medical perspective, coming down to, what your insurance covers and what it doesn't.
Well, if it were to go down to a state level, I would always assume that maybe if they were to not allow you to like at a federal level be protected up to 15 weeks, that maybe the government or state levels would make it easier to access birth control. And it seems like there's not always the same response. Like you said, it's not as organized, right? And I guess maybe why is that? Why is there not? Is there organizations who are trying to improve that so people can learn more about it? I mean, I know you worked with the Planned Parenthoods and so on. So, but it seems like there's not always the same effect where it's like people want to ban abortion completely, but then like they also don't want to give women the opportunity to have access to better care. And it's like, why? I don't know how you can't you can't just have like, if you're going to expect to do one, you have to do the other. Otherwise you're just going to have a lot of issues. So I guess like maybe why is that?
Oh man, I can't answer that question, Mike, but
Right.
first of all, I just want to validate that that is absolutely true. And I can't answer why that paradox exists, because I'll be honest, it makes my brain want to explode on a daily basis.
Hmm.
And then honestly, you add in the layer recently of, people saying you can't force me to wear a mask and it's my body and my choice. And like that layer, the hypocrisy of it all just kind of makes my head want to pop off, because I agree. To me, if you are going to not allow women to be able to access abortion and be able to control pregnancy, then I think it is morally obligate that you allow them to be able to access something that would allow them to effectively family plan and to be able to effectively, decide when they want to be pregnant and when they don't. And I think pillars of that would be effective access to effective contraception. But then I think even beyond that is, then you also have to support women to be able to raise families in safe communities and safe environments. And so I think, on the flip side too, to me, it then is morally obligate that you would have to provide excellent, healthcare to those babies that are born, and access to formula for those children when they need to have formula. And we don't see that the same governmental structures that are putting those restrictions are propping up those supports for women. Part of what I would say is that I think unfortunately, our legislatures are still primarily run by folks who they themselves don't have uteruses. They themselves haven't had to plan for these things. It's largely white men, which is a factor to what's happening here. But I also think, we're still uncomfortable with the idea that women can be sexual creatures and, have sex and have good sex lives and be able to plan for pregnancies when they want to and not when they don't want to be. And that still is something that makes folks uncomfortable on some deep level. But I cannot answer why those two things don't go together. I think part of that question too, though, raised for me, these folks have been, as we mentioned, planning this for decades. This SCOTUS decision, planting these seeds for decades in order to make this happen. And so where I thought you were going to go and ask me is, why can't we get together opposition and be organized and structure ways to counter this wave that we're seeing? And part of me is a little critical of us and says, well, gosh, we don't organize as well, or we don't get our act together, or we don't, do this in the right way. But part of what I think I'm coming to understand and recognize is that this is being done intentionally. We are being, the communities that we need to show up and vote are showing up and voting, but they're gerrymandered and they are, basically set up to not be able to have power within the states. One of the states that we talk the most about with abortion is Texas. It has one of the most restrictive abortion laws in the country right now. Oklahoma just trumped it. Congratulations, Oklahoma. But people say, well, gosh, it's just that Republican-dominated Texas. But truth be told, when you look at the population of Texas right now, it really is swinging in a different direction. The problem is it's gerrymandered out of having effective power in the state and local legislatures and the state structures for government. So, I don't know. I'm a little flummoxed with what to do, honestly. And frankly, this is not my area of expertise, but I feel flummoxed in the same way about gun control right now. Like, how do we mobilize? How do we change? Because this is unacceptable. But we have not been as effective as the other side.
Yeah, well, I also think there is some interesting, we're kind of going down a tangent in politics, but, I think there is part of this, over the past several years, it seems like people are divided into one category or the other, and having an opinion that perhaps goes over party lines can make people hesitant to mobilize. So perhaps you're just a person who generally is like more conservative in finances or something like that, and maybe they are more libertarian when it comes to these ideals, and they're like, well, I don't want to be categorized over there or like this, and maybe there's some fear in that too. So I would like to think that perhaps people are generally good, and they would like to help and give people more options. But I do believe that people, like you had said, there are people in power who are absolutists in the way that they think. And unfortunately, that is the state of the world as it is right now. And hopefully we can see change and start to head in a better direction. And hopefully we can start seeing a little bit of crossover on party lines, because I feel like having this absolutist idea is definitely not a good route to go down by any stretch of the means.
Yeah, it's not, and I feel like along those lines with abortion, I feel like I've always tried to be pretty reasonable about abortion. Like, in my personal life, I will say to like friends or family members, like, I don't need you to think what I do is good or right. But I just need you to let me do my thing, like I need you don't necessarily have to agree with me. And I'm okay with that. I really am. I don't need everybody to feel the way about abortion that I do as an abortion provider. But I do think we need to respect that there are differences of opinion, and that fundamentally that we can't be absolutist in that and say, then we're cutting off access for half of the country, which is why, honestly, I really had gotten to a place in my career before a couple of years ago where I'm not going to say I like respect the protesters outside the clinic, but I am like, all right, you do you, right? Like, I'm going to do me today. And your truth is to show up and pray today. And like, okay, I'm okay with that. As long as you don't personally threaten me, as long as you don't make me feel unsafe, I kind of respect that. And you get to do you.
I wanted
Came
to ask you, like, because what you do is you have to be empathetic all the time, and you're speaking up for people who don't have voices a lot of the time. But I feel it's almost the same conversation on the other side, where a lot of people will be like, I'm speaking up for this individual or person who doesn't have a voice either, right?
Mhm.
Like, you guys are like doing the same thing at the same time for different individuals, right? Or they believe so, right? And so what would you say to somebody who says, like, I'm speaking up for the person who can't speak? Like, what, I'm sure you've gotten that before.
Yeah, yeah. So what I say is, this does kind of get into the bigger question that you asked earlier, which is like, when does life begin? Okay,
Yes.
but so I'll just give you a little glimpse of sort of how I think about this. Is that truly the abortions that I do, the very vast majority of abortions, whether it's by medication or the in-clinic procedure, the patients that I'm interacting with, I mean, we're really talking about physiologically from like a medical perspective, literally a clump of cells at that point.
Yeah.
So for me, at that point, when if an anti-abortion protester were to say, well, I'm here to speak for the voice of the unborn child that you're going to murder today. I've heard that. Okay. What I would say is that is not an unborn child. That is literally a physical piece of the patient who I'm going to be taking care of today.
Mm.
That is her body. That is her existence. And that thing, it is hers. That is her decision to make. And I am here today to medically assure that she's able to sort of be pregnant when it's the right time for her to be, and not be pregnant when it's not the right time for her to be. And I don't care what that reason is, because I know that she fundamentally knows what is best for what is happening with her body. So to me, it is physically and emotionally her tissue. It is what she wants to do with her body. And I should, yeah, yes. And so that is how I conceptualize it and I think of it. And so my response to that person would be, I am here to take care of my patient today. And that patient is the person who's sitting in front of me. And I'm here to help her with what the truth is for her body today.
Mm.
So that's how I would respond to it. Because to me, from a very medical and physiologic perspective, this is that person's tissue, and it's not my decision for what will happen with that tissue. So that's my perspective as an abortion provider.
Yeah, no, I like that, and I like that you were able to, even like, to the protesters, because our last conversation we had, you discussed like going to work and you have people outside your clinic, and death threats and all these other things, and you have every opportunity to hate every single one of those people, but instead, you look at from their perspective and realize, like, it's all within the same idea as us as humans, right? They're trying to stand up in something they believe, so long as they're not trying to hurt you, right? And same thing
Right.
with you, right? Like, you're trying to do the same thing. Well, I really appreciate you sharing your opinion on that, and providing such great detail. I want to provide a little bit more detail, though, and if this were to go through and where it goes to the states,
Yeah.
how can women access care, and like, are there certain states that people should maybe like know about so they can go and get care if they need to get an abortion and so on?
Absolutely. It's a great question. So first of all, I want to point out there are a couple of really good resources. One is called the Guttmacher Institute. I'll type it into the chat for you. And then also the Center for Reproductive Rights. Those are both really great websites. They're both research institutes that research not just abortion care, but reproductive and sexual health care in general. And they will be updating live time as these changes roll out. So what I know right now are hypotheticals about what will happen, but the actual nitty gritty of how this will go down in each state, we're going to have to kind of see play out. So that's my way of saying I have some loose ideas of what will happen, but when it comes to the nitty gritty, I think being acquainted with resources and following up on it are really important. I also will say there's a couple of really great like social media channels as well. One's called Thank God for Abortion. the National Abortion Federation, Planned Parenthood, all of their social media channels have a lot of really good information. And then down at a more state level, I would say like Google, what is my local Planned Parenthood? And usually your local Planned Parenthood will also have like their own website, their own social media channels. And those are important to follow to know exactly what's happening in your own state, because it is different from one state to the next. So, you know, I flew a couple of hours this morning and I'm in a totally different world in New York State now. So essentially, if things go through as we see in this leaked decision, which we think will come out probably the last week of June, first week of July. People are saying June 27th, but we'll see exactly when it comes out. We think pretty quickly after it comes out, it will mean that about 26 states will have little to no access to abortion. And those states are kind of the ones that you might anticipate. Actually, can I share a screen? No, I can't share a screen, it's disabled. But those states are kind of the ones that you would maybe predict, predominantly in the South and the middle of the country, including Texas, but then also has some seepage out west in places like Idaho and Wyoming, and then the Dakotas kind of moving over. So really in the South, the Southeast, we would see pretty restricted access to abortion, as well as some of those other states. And then, you know, it's our blue coastal states where we will see access to abortion continue. And the reason we know that there will be access to abortion in places like California, Oregon, Washington, New York, I believe Vermont and New Jersey. I think then there's some question marks about like New Hampshire and Maine as well, but you know, kind of our big hitters that you would anticipate. The reason why we know that there will be protection there is that there is state constitutional protection for abortions in those states. So when I talked again about when Roe v. Wade falls, it will default down to the state protection. Those are the places where we know there's actually on the books state legislation that says there's constitutional protection for abortion. So you will be able to access abortion in those states. The problem is that was a pretty short list that I went through. There are some states kind of in between that are a bit question marks, or where we say, oh, we think there'll be access, but maybe only up to 12 or 15 weeks. So maybe there'll be a little bit more limited access in those states. And, you know, those are states like maybe Nevada, Colorado certainly currently has good protection for abortion, but it's not legally protected in the Constitution. So it creates some question marks if there ever were to be challenges there. So it's really going to come down to kind of what's happening in your state. I guess the only people who really can know what's going to happen are folks who live in Washington, Oregon, California, New York, right. New Jersey, those kind of places that we think of as kind of bastions of liberalism in general, the coastal elite, as they like to say. So we'll see patients traveling there. And I will tell you, I've seen patients traveling from Texas already the past few months. They travel to Ohio, they travel to New York. You never know why you might end up going to a place like, I had a patient, her sister lives in Cleveland and she lives in Dallas. So it actually turned out the cheapest way for her to do it was to fly to Cleveland because she had a free place to stay, as opposed to other places where she'd have to pay for a hotel too. So I've already seen patients traveling due to some of the restrictions on the books in Texas. And so what we will see when this goes through is that a lot of patients in a lot of states will have to travel in order to access abortion care.
Do you recommend that people reach out to a doctor before going anywhere, not just like driving up and being like, hey, I'm here? Like, do you recommend them establishing a line of communication before they do that? Or how do you recommend someone going about that if that goes through?
It's a great question, Mike. I think it's actually kind of individualized depending on where that patient may live, but also what their particular circumstance may be. A lot of folks may be in a good place in order to be able to access abortion. But I do see a lot of folks who are, maybe in challenging situations or in situations where their safety is in question when they're trying to access abortion care. And unfortunately, like the local family doctor in a small town may not always be the best place to start. And unfortunately, within the medical community, there's not consensus about abortion. And that is also something that is challenging for me, is that, not all doctors will appropriately counsel patients about what their options are with regards to, what they may choose to do with a pregnancy. So I'd love to say start with your local doc, but that may not always be the best place for folks. So I think increasingly making a connection with a place where you may be able to get an abortion and starting with them, calling them, saying, how do I get this going? What do I need to do? Is a good place. And then also grassroots organizations like abortion funds, I think are going to be increasingly helpful. A lot of what I've heard about happening across the country is really trying to prop up a grassroots network of local abortion funds to be able to connect folks in communities to be able to go get abortion care, and not having that happen via some centralized 1-800 number, because that makes it more complicated with safety and other legality concerns, but really having that community build from within. And so I think, the question I get the most lately is like, what do we do to support abortion? And my number one recommendation is to support the abortion clinics via Planned Parenthood. And also most of the independent abortion clinics out there are part of what's called the National Abortion Federation, or NAF, supporting both of those, both Planned Parenthood and the independent abortion clinics, but then also finding the funds out there that you can support within your own community, and then also more nationally. And there are tons of abortion funds out there. I can actually include some links to you, Mike. I don't think it helps to like rattle them all off here, but I can include some links for you
I
to
can link
maybe
them all
prop
below
up
as
with
well.
this. Exactly. And there's actually a couple places where you can go that's like clearinghouse of all the abortion funds. So you can say like, I live in this state, and it'll say, okay, here are the 6 abortion fund collectives in your state. And people have said, hey, can I donate my time, my house? I can have people spend the night in my house. Really, truly, what we think will be best for patients right now is money, for them to be able to get from point A to point B the best way that makes sense for them. There's all kinds of layers of safety concerns about creating a rideshare network and like a abortion Airbnb, which are all really creative ideas, but ultimately probably the person who can get themselves to and from the quickest is going to be the person. And sometimes what they need is just money, or the ability to purchase the plane ticket that they need. And so I'm really encouraging people to give money to local abortion funds.
That sounds like the Underground Railroad of like abortion clinics. I don't know if that's something that you want to establish, right? I mean, it's something that you want to be able to not normalize, but to be able to make it seem legit and people are safe and there's no weird things going on, like and putting people in harm's way.
Yeah. I want to take a moment here, just because you said that. I do want to shout out one organization in particular. It's called Sister Song, and it's an organization that was founded by Black women, and is an organization of women of color out of Atlanta. And they're a grassroots advocacy organization, but they created this term over 20 years ago now called reproductive justice. And I just want to like shout out that it was created by them. I think it's gotten co-opted a lot by like white women in these spaces. So it's really important to talk about where this comes from. But what their main kind of guiding principle, and I always like to just like read it because I think it's so important, is that every person has the human right to maintain personal bodily autonomy, to have children, to not have children, and to parent the children that we have in safe and sustainable communities. And I bring that up partially because we got off on the gun violence thing earlier. And I just think this is so important to kind of talk about, creating these safe communities for people. And I think the way that we're going to be able to do that is within our communities. And so, yes, we want to create safe pathways for people to be able to get to the abortion care that they need. And so I think that trust comes a lot more if you're able to connect with someone within your own community who can then connect you with someone who can get an abortion instead of maybe, again, calling a 1-800 number and getting connected to a random clinic in Connecticut when you live in the middle of Alabama maybe isn't going to be super helpful to you. So really having that come from within people's own communities, and funding them to do what they need to do to be able to access services. Interestingly, within the abortion community, and particularly the leaders in our community who are of color themselves, are really pushing back on using analogies to the Underground Railroad, just because of kind of re-evoking the trauma of slavery, but also really wanting to push back on this idea that women need to go underground for these services, and wanting, to keep this above ground, essentially, and say this is essential healthcare that we need to be able to provide women. But obviously there are increasing legal restrictions around doing that. So
Sure.
sorry, that's my little tangent to say that I'm also really trying in some ways as a white woman in this space right now, to prop up the leaders within this space who are more embedded within the community than I am, or who are of color themselves, and trying to be a better kind of support, and saying, maybe I don't have all the answers, and maybe my best role is to fund and communicate and support behind the scenes.
We'll certainly provided so many awesome resources for that. And it will definitely be hopefully continuing in the manner where people are getting more information about this, so that way we can spread awareness and people understand this does go through, people know where to go and who to contact. And for people who may not have insurance, this is kind of the best way to also access the ability to have an abortion. Perhaps they don't have insurance and can't talk to a medical doctor. Are these resources the place to go as well?
Yes, definitely. I think the best place to start for all of this, there's the clearinghouse, kind of the one that's like the national abortion funds, is called abortionfunds.org.
Mm-hmm.
And I think this is a really great place to start for anyone, because it not only is talking about funding and how to get from point A to point B, but it's also like, what is abortion? What might I need? And so I think that's a really great place to start. Unfortunately, within the abortion space, the internet can be both a great place for information and also a place with lots of bad and really deeply uninformed information too about abortion care. So I think this is an important conversation to have about where's a good place to go? Where can I get accurate information? And I would say, this is one of the good things about Planned Parenthood too. It has high brand recognition. Everybody knows basically Planned Parenthood. They've heard that before. So I would say going to the Planned Parenthood website is a place where you're always going to get accurate information too. I've heard lots of really outlandish stories about stuff on the internet about abortion from patients, and been shown different things from patients about abortion on the internet. And there's a lot of really bad stuff out there. So I think finding a place for good information is really important. Planned Parenthood is always a great place to start, and then abortionfunds.org too.
And of course, this podcast, right? This podcast hopefully provided. Yes,
exactly,
hopefully provided great information for everyone.
The other one too, Instagram, Thank God for Abortion. They do a lot of really good work. There's also lots of great stuff. And then SisterSong.org is the organization of Black women that I mentioned before, that also puts out lots of really important information. So,
and I'll be sure to link everything below. So if people are trying to write things down or try to follow along here, they'll be able to find all the links below. It was great to have you on again. I really appreciate you coming on to explain all of this. I know I've been kind of a little confused in the past couple of weeks, just trying to figure out what's going on and why there's so much outrage, but clearly makes way more sense, and having you to be able to be a valuable and important resource for me and hopefully other listeners. It's a great and an honor. So I really appreciate it.
No problem. And certainly I would say if you get feedback and there are lots of other questions that came up, let me know, because I would love to, keep the good information flowing as much as possible, the good and accurate information flowing as much as possible. So if I can be helpful down the road, let me know.
Absolutely. Well, last questions here. We've done this before. We always had the last final 3 questions for everybody. First question, if you had the attention of everyone in the world for 30 seconds, what would you say?
Right now, what I would say is trust people to know what is best for their own bodies, particularly when it comes to reproductive and sexual autonomy. And I mean that both for abortion care, but also for my trans and non-binary patients, and also for my folks who are working through substance use disorder right now. Trust people to know that they know what's right for their own bodies.
Second question, what book do you recommend, whether you're reading now or in the past?
Yes. Oh my gosh, I'm so glad you asked that. I want to shout out to my really good friend and colleague, Dr. Meera Shah. She wrote an excellent book called You're the Only One I've Told, and it's stories about abortion. She's an excellent doc. She tells some really important stories. And I think for every person I've recommended it to, they've come back to me and said, man, I never thought that, somebody might be going through XYZ situation. And they also often say to me, wow, you must hear such amazing stories on a daily basis. And I think Meera did a great job of putting together some stories that really give a glimpse at what we get to encounter on a day-to-day basis.
Shout out to her in the book as well. And you have to give it a listen. I'll have to download it because is it on Audible or no?
I believe so. Yes.
Okay, good. Sweet. And then last question, where can people find or learn from you and find out where you are on social media as well as any other website?
I do keep most of my social media private still, just because I still have to approve my followers. I'm very old school. And I do that because I still have some layers of concern around my safety. And so I'm not just totally open on social media channels. But certainly I would say, send me a message. I'm on Instagram. I'm Dr. Amy PK, AMYPK. Send me a direct message and I can always approve you. And then otherwise, let's see, I otherwise don't have much of a presence. You're my social media presence.
Sweet. Yeah. Well, hopefully we can continue building that. And if anyone has questions, you can always reach out to me as well. And I can just forward them over to you. So
Absolutely. So that's actually, I've had a few friends lately be like, you got to go more public about all this stuff. And I'm kind of toying with it, but there is always these layers too of concern around safety.
I would 100% agree. I mean, yeah, I could definitely imagine that. It's certainly a cause for concern. And, you're also doing a lot and you're very busy. So I'm assuming it's not at the forefront of your mind as well.
I'm like, but if you want to know what my runs were like this week, I'm on Strava too. So that's my other social media.
There we go. You get to see how the stress runs are going.
Exactly. Absolutely. Actually, very seriously, because this is what you do for a living.
Right.
That's been a really important part of pandemic and then all of this recent stuff happening between the Supreme Court and gun violence in our country. I'd say my number one outlet is running. It's the best. And
gotta get it out somehow.
Therapists who keep us able to do it. So thank you.
Absolutely.
Don't mind those little annoying Achilles tendons. They get you back on it. So
they do. Yes. All right. Well, thank you for coming on the podcast again. I really appreciate it.
You're welcome. It was good to see you again.
Likewise.